All right, let's try this again here. I got into about 10 or 11 minutes of this webcast on the intricacies, and I realized that there's a lot of information here that I need to cover, and I don't think I should cover it all in one night. So I will start doing these videos one at a time, and just see where they go. So tonight, go to my website, TonyLaporta.com. Pull up the intricacies of the pivot points. That's down at the bottom, and click on it, and you'll see. I've written a little bit here about 34 plus years in the business. It's actually 36 these days, but you'll see that little table, sort of middle right, with the pivot, first resistance, second resistance, first support. 5 hour, 6 hour, 8 hour, blah 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 blah. And I'll use those as for my examples here. So you see that here the pivot is 1500. How do we get that pivot? We had the previous days, and I do these numbers here based on Globex trade. So that would be 24-hour trade in the S&Ps. I do my charts on pit session, but I do my mathematical pivot points on the 24-hour Globex. So the pivot is basically the high plus the low plus the close divided by 3. Everyone does it. Every trader in the world has a pivot, and that's how they get their pivot. And when every trader has a pivot in their back pocket and the market's approaching that at 7 o'clock at night or 9:30 in the morning, every trader is on that pivot. It's going to work. It's going to at least work for a scalp. So if you're long and the market is rallying up to the pivot, take your profits. Very good chance that you want to take your profits a tick in front of the pivot, because that's what everyone else is going to be doing, is looking at that pivot to take profits. So it's as easy as that. Now, to get these other points, that's where the formula comes involved. It's a Fibonacci-based formula that I learned in 1994. My friend Neil Yeager, who I work with, he had his own way of doing things, and for months, he did his things his way. And after he began to see day after day after day how these pivot points, the first support, second support, how they came into play over and over and over again, he became a believer in the points. And so anyhow, the points used, for example, no matter where the market opens, the point above is resistance and the point below is support. So I'm going to quit reading that paragraph, and I'm just going to look at the points in general. So let's say the S&Ps open at 1495 at 5 o'clock at night. The first thing you want to look at here is the second support point is 1492 quarter. So that's going to be your support. The first support point at 1496 and 3/4 is your resistance. What you do at 1495, those are your issues. If you like the market, you're going to buy them. If you don't like the market, you're going to sell them. But if you buy them and the market trades up to 96 and 3/4, you probably want to get out. If you sell them and the market trades down to 92 1/4, the way you're supposed to trade these pivots, you want to get out. The gambling man will buy some at 92 1/4, but won't get greedy. Sell them at 93, 93 1/4. These are scalping points. Don't get greedy. When we get to talking in other videos about the high probability trades, then we'll get into other types of longer term trades with these pivots. But I'm just concentrating on the pivot tonight and the points, and we'll talk a little bit about the midpoints. And sometime in the week I'll touch on a few more of the intricacy rules, how I use these points to my advantage, how I plan on using them to my advantage in the coming days, weeks, and months ahead. So we'll take for another example, let's say the market's going to open at 5 o'clock Central Time, Globex. It's going to open at 1510. It's going to open up better. So now 1513.5, the second resistance point is resistance. 1505.5. The first resistance point is support. And it's as easy as that. You know, the point above is resistance, the point below is support. When I scale this down a little bit further and it says the midpoints are points. So let's give an example of a midpoint. So if I look at the pivot at 1500 even, and I only use midpoints when the points start to get wide. So I see the pivot at 15 even, the first resistance at 1505.5, the midpoint is 1502 3/4. A 5.5 point range isn't that big. So I'll ignore the midpoint at 1502 3/4. But if you look between the first resistance point and the second resistance point, 1R and 2R, that's eight full handles. So I will now look at a midpoint, and that midpoint is 1509.5. So if the market opens up at 08 and it starts to rally, I'll be taking profits at 09.5. Because that's what you do, because it should hold the first time up. That's if you want to, if you're saying, oh, I want to sell into a higher opening, that would be where you first start to look at 1509.5. So that's about it really for the pivot and the points. I'm just going to, I need a whole day just to touch on this high probability trade, and I don't want to get this video going over too long because people will get bored with it. But you know, when I talk about the midpoints are points, and I put up Japanese yen points, you know, and all of a sudden, you know, you have one point in the yen at 84 even and another point at 84.50. Well, you could probably use a midpoint there at 84.25. You know, that would be a midpoint. But if you have a point at 84.10 and one at 84.30, I mean, the midpoint's 84.20. No, I don't. You know, that's, you know, you have to use your own judgment on these midpoints. That's if you're scalping. So, but there's one other level. If you scale down to the second pivot point below and the second pivot point above, that's 2S and 2R. So 2S and 2R, I don't know why it is, but those points come into, when they do come into play, either overnight or after the pit session markets open, you know, when the US markets open, if they do come into play, they are phenomenal levels and they tend to hold the first time up if we're going into resistance, or down if we're going into support. And, you know, if you're sitting there and you're telling yourself, well, you know what, I want to go to bed, but I want to sell, you know, and the S&P is like, the S&P is trading, let's go back to that table, and the S&P is trading 1508.5 or something. And it's like, you know, I want to sell this. I think it's going to rally. So you put your offer in at 13.5. Obviously, you have to put your stop up there somewhere. You decide where you're going to put your stop in. What are you looking for? You know, if you're selling 13.5s, you're probably looking for 09 halves, 05 halves, maybe double O's. You should be looking for the pivot, really. But if you're selling 13 halves, you know, you've got to put a stop somewhere. You decide where you put your stop. You know, I'd have mine up in the teens somewhere. But that's neither here nor there. You go to bed, you want to sell the market. The market's trading 1508, 09. If you're going to take a shot, sell it at the second resistance point. Or the market's trading 1497, and you go to bed and you want to buy the market. Buy it at the second support point, 1492.25. Put your bid in there. You know, put your stop in, whatever, have many handles as you think is worth the risk, and that's where you try to buy them. The second, or if you're trading in the course of the day and you're long and the market is going up to that second resistance point, 1513.5, take your profits. Just take your profits. Just take your profits. By then, you know, you probably got 4 or 5 handles in a trade. Take your profits, turn the machine off, say thank you very much, gotta go. You'd be amazed how many times the market will stop at the second resistance point on the way up or the second support point on the way down. It's uncanny. So, last thing about the pivot. The pivot tends to trade, I would say, 75% of the time. So almost 4 out of 5 days in a week, you'll see the pivot trade sometime in a 24-hour period. So, if you're a little bit unsure and the market's trading around the second support point, maybe you fade it there, you buy the second support point, and all of a sudden if you buy it well and you'll know you bought it well, and the market all of a sudden trades above 14.96 3/4, and we haven't traded the pivot all night, it's probably going to trade the pivot. And if it gets above the pivot, and the market held the second support point, it's probably going to go to the second resistance point, and that's the pivot equilibrium trade. But that's something we'll discuss at a later time. So that's it for now. Sort of explained the pivot, I sort of explained the points. And I've talked about the second resistance point and the second support point. Those are critical points. And if you have a trade on, and if you're short the S&Ps at 14.98, and they're trading down to 14.95, you're going to yourself, if they get down to 92.25, that's where I'm covering. And then you don't care after that. Then you turn the machine off. One thing I can tell you about these points, as we begin to get wide ranges, the points work really, really well for scalping. Scalping only. So, all right, that's all I have. I'll make another one of these videos midweek sometime. I don't know what I'll talk about, but I'll figure it out. The high probability trade eventually. Or what I will do is I'll actually look for a high probability trade in the coming days and then talk about that trade and talk about how it materialized, if it worked, if it didn't work. So, actually, that's what I'll begin to do with these videos here. I'll wait till see a trade, and then we'll talk about it. So, Tony Laporta with TonyLaporta.com signing off.